Cairn slapped school crossing guard for delaying traffic. Didn't know he was a decorated war veteran. The bitter wind of the early morning sliced through the sleepy suburban neighborhood like a blade, its icy fingers wrapping around cars, school bags, and bare noses alike. It was the kind of winter chill that made people want to stay in bed a little longer. But life didn't stop just because it was cold. The drop-off lane in front of Millridge Elementary was already bustling with activity as a stream of SUVs, minivans, and compact cars queued up along the curb. Engines rumbled. Wipers squeaked. Horns blared with impatience. Amid this cacophony stood Harold Jenkins, wrapped in a thick safety jacket and wearing his crossing guard vest with quiet dignity. His breath misted in the air as he raised his gloved hand, stopping traffic so a cluster of children could cross. They shuffled through the zebra stripes like ducklings, clutching lunchboxes and giggling behind scarves, the crunch of their boots muffled by the snow still lightly falling. Harold offered them a warm, encouraging smile and a soft, "Good morning," though his face was weathered and pale, a permanent mark left by years of exposure to harsher climates than this. Behind the wheel of a gleaming white SUV, Karen Whitmore tapped her manicured fingers on the steering wheel with increasing fury. Her blonde hair, sprayed to helmet perfection, barely moved as she craned her neck to get a better view. Her oversized sunglasses were perched low on her nose, and her lips were twisted in a scowl of righteous impatience. She had already been late leaving the house because her son Max refused to eat the soggy toaster waffles she'd practically thrown onto his plate, and now this dinosaur of a man was holding up her morning even further. She glanced at the clock on the dash, huffed, then leaned on her horn, one long, angry blast that made everyone in the vicinity flinch, including the kids still in the crosswalk. "Unbelievable," she muttered, twisting in her seat to look at Max. "This is what we're dealing with now. These people think they run the road." Max stared out his window silently, wishing he could sink into the leather seat. He didn't like it when his mom got like this. It made his stomach twist into knots. He clutched his backpack tightly, eyes darting to the group of kids who had just finished crossing and to Mr. Jenkins, who was already signaling the next batch to wait as he prepared to allow the frozen line of cars to move. But Karen wasn't about to wait any longer. Without warning, she threw the SUV into park, unbuckled her seatbelt, and swung the door open with dramatic flair. Her high-heeled boots crunched into the slush as she stormed across the pavement, her coat flaring behind her like a cape of entitlement. "Excuse me," she shouted, her voice cutting through the cold air. "You've held up traffic long enough." Mr. Jenkins turned calmly, his lined face showing only the faintest trace of surprise. "Ma'am, please return to your vehicle. Children are still." "I don't give a damn about your little game of red light, green light, all right," Karen snapped, getting right in his face. "Some of us have places to be. I'm not sitting in a line all day because some fossil wants to feel important." A few parents nearby, standing outside their cars or walking younger kids to the front doors, turned to see what the commotion was about. Phones appeared in hands. Gasps slipped out as Karen, red-faced and breathing hard, suddenly raised her hand and slapped Mr. Jenkins across the cheek. The sound echoed, sharp and ugly. He staggered slightly but remained upright, blinking once, his gloved hand slowly rising to touch the reddening side of his face. For a few moments, there was only the whisper of falling snow and the muffled hum of idling cars. Then a voice rang out. "What the hell is wrong with you?" A young mother ran forward, pushing a stroller and leaving her daughter behind. Another parent, a dad in a worn parka, came up beside her. "Did she just hit him? Are you kidding me right now?" Karen stood with her hand still half raised, eyes wild, as if surprised that no one else was congratulating her for her bold act of morning efficiency. He was being unreasonable. He was holding up traffic. "He's doing his job," someone shouted. "You don't slap someone over a delay." Those were kids crossing the road. The crowd began to form around them, not aggressive but firm. Mr. Jenkins, still composed despite the sting on his face, held up a hand. "Please," he said gently, "everyone calm down. Let's not escalate this." A teacher who had been helping students out of a minivan now hurried over. "Mr. Jenkins, are you all right?" she asked, concern etched across her face. Then she turned sharply to Cairn. "Ma'am, you need to step away, right now." Cairn scoffed. "Don't you ma'am me. I'm the victim here. He's abusing his authority. You people give him a vest and suddenly he thinks he's king of the road." At that, a murmur rippled through the crowd. "Do you even know who he is?" someone said. It was an older woman, wrapped in a wool coat, her voice trembling not from the cold but from outrage. Cairn turned, lips curled. "No, and I don't care." The woman stepped closer, eyes sharp as knives. "That man served 3 tours in Afghanistan. He's a decorated veteran, saved lives, came home with injuries. He volunteers here every single day, rain or shine, snow or sleet. He doesn't have to be here. He chooses to." Cairn's jaw twitched. She looked at Mr. Jenkins again, this time with a flicker of uncertainty, but quickly masked it with more venom. "Well, if he's such a hero, maybe he should know better than to make people late." Police sirens could now be heard in the distance. Someone must have already called them, perhaps the teacher or one of the nearby parents. Cairn's eyes darted toward her SUV as if wondering whether she could just leave now and pretend none of this happened. Max still sat in the passenger seat, watching it all unfold, eyes wide with something that looked like fear, but also shame. Mr. Jenkins sighed, turning away from the crowd to return to his post. But a bruise was beginning to bloom on his cheek, and the line of cars still sat unmoving, their drivers watching closely, some filming, others frozen in shock. The snowfall picked up, heavier now, settling on his shoulders like metals, soft and quiet, as he raised his arm to wave the next group of children across. The world kept moving, but something had changed, and not just the weather. The sirens grew louder, a piercing wail that seemed to match the tension thickening in the crisp winter air. As the flashing lights of the patrol car approached the scene, most parents stepped aside, forming a semicircle as if silently signaling where the trouble lay. Cairn had crossed her arms, standing her ground in front of Mr. Jenkins, her eyes darting uneasily between the crowd and the approaching officers. She didn't look nearly as bold as she had moments before. Instead, her bravado was beginning to crack beneath the growing weight of attention, judgment, and consequences. Max, still sitting motionless in the passenger seat of the SUV, had curled slightly toward the door, his face pressed to the window, watching with a mixture of dread and disbelief. He could feel every pair of eyes on the vehicle, and in his gut, he knew this moment would stick with him longer than anything else that had happened at school. The patrol car slowed to a stop near the front of the drop-off zone. 2 officers stepped out, one younger, the other graying at the temples, both clearly experienced in reading the atmosphere of a crowd. They approached cautiously, the older officer's eyes scanning faces, absorbing the energy, assessing where to begin. The teacher who had come to Mr. Jenkins' side earlier stepped forward first, gesturing toward him with a trembling hand. "It was her," she said clearly, pointing at Cairn. "She got out of her car and hit him, in front of everyone." Cairn's face twisted with irritation. "Are you people serious right now?" she barked, throwing up her hands. "I did hit him. I slapped him. There's a difference, and only because he was deliberately holding up traffic to feel important." The younger officer's brows lifted slightly. "Ma'am, you're admitting to striking a city employee on duty." "That's not what I said," she snapped, then hesitated, realizing too late that it was exactly what she had said. Mr. Jenkins remained calm and silent, his arms crossed gently over his chest. He didn't speak up to accuse her, didn't raise his voice or point fingers. He stood like a mountain weathering a storm, content to let the world speak for him. And speak it did. Several parents raised their phones, others gave statements on the spot. The older officer asked the teacher to walk him through what happened, while the younger began taking names from nearby witnesses. Meanwhile, the attention of the crowd shifted again. The older woman who had spoken earlier, the one who had revealed Mr. Jenkins' military background, now stood with her phone out, scrolling quickly. Then she found what she was looking for and turned it toward those closest to her. On the screen was an old newspaper article titled "From War Zones to Crosswalks: The Quiet Life of Harold Jenkins." It was an in-depth profile, complete with a photo of a younger Mr. Jenkins in uniform, flanked by two fellow soldiers, all of them covered in dirt, dust, and the grim exhaustion of a combat medic's life. The article detailed how he had saved 4 wounded comrades during an ambush in Kandahar, dragging them to safety under heavy fire despite being shot in the leg himself. He had received the Purple Heart and 2 commendations for bravery. After being discharged due to injury, he moved back to his hometown and quietly volunteered wherever he was needed. For the past 7 years, he had manned that crosswalk every school day, without fail. The image quickly spread. Parents began texting it, sharing it on local Facebook groups, whispering it to each other. Even the officers paused to glance at the screen when the article was held up to them. The mood shifted again, from righteous anger to reverent silence. One by one, people turned back to Mr. Jenkins with renewed respect, realizing the man in the reflective vest wasn't just a retiree passing time. He was a protector, someone who had already given more than most ever would. Cairn saw the shift and tried to rally. So what? That doesn't excuse anything. Just because someone was in the military doesn't mean they can boss people around or block traffic like they own the place. The crowd's collective disgust thickened. A parent standing nearby muttered, "Lady, you really don't know when to stop, do you?" Others shook their heads or turned away entirely. A few walked toward Mr. Jenkins and quietly offered him words of support, one parent placing a gloved hand on his shoulder with a grateful nod. The officer who had taken initial statements now approached Cairn directly. "Ma'am, based on what we've gathered, we'll need you to come with us for a formal statement. You're not under arrest, but you are being detained for questioning related to an assault allegation." Cairn gaped at him. "You're serious? I'm being detained for a slap?" "That's still physical contact, and multiple witnesses have confirmed it. We have footage, too." She looked around and saw the sea of faces, almost all of them staring at her with open judgment or quiet revulsion. Max still hadn't moved from the SUV, but the look on his face stung her more than the cold air or the accusation. His mouth was tight, his eyes brimming with shame. Her lips trembled slightly, but she bit it back and turned away from the crowd. "Fine," she muttered, raising her chin. "Let's get it over with." The officers walked her to the patrol car and she climbed in without another word. As the door closed, a hush fell over the gathering. Slowly, traffic began to resume. Mr. Jenkins, still standing in the same spot, gave a gentle wave and resumed his duties. The kids continued to arrive. Parents continued to drive forward. The rhythm of mourning returned, though nothing felt quite the same. Inside the school building, staff members spoke in hushed tones about what had happened. One of the students who had been crossing the road at the time was now drawing a picture of Mr. Harold the Hero for their class. A few teachers planned to organize something small to honor him. Meanwhile, Mr. Jenkins remained outside until the final bell rang. When it did, he let out a long breath and leaned briefly against his signpost, not from pain, but from the emotional heaviness that had crept into the morning. As he turned to go back inside, he noticed the older woman waiting for him near the gate. She handed him a folded copy of the article she'd shown the crowd, now printed out and tucked inside a protective sleeve. "You might want to hang on to this," she said gently. "People need to remember." He looked at the photo of himself in the dirt, surrounded by the weight of memory, and gave her a grateful nod. Then he tucked the sleeve under his arm and continued walking, not with pride or arrogance, but with the quiet strength of a man who had seen the worst and still chose to be kind. The day passed in a blur of whispers and buzzing phones as the news of the incident outside Millridge Elementary rippled through the town like an electric current. It started on local Facebook groups, where parents uploaded video clips with captions like, "You won't believe what this woman did to our crossing guard," and "This man served our country, and she slapped him for doing his job." Before noon, the story had reached the local news station, and by evening, it had been picked up by national outlets looking for the next viral controversy to stir up social media. Karen Whitmore's face was everywhere, mouth twisted mid-shout, hand raised mid-slap, the moment frozen in pixels for the world to dissect. Mr. Jenkins' name, meanwhile, was trending for entirely different reasons. The article from years prior had resurfaced and was now plastered across Twitter, Instagram, and Reddit, his stoic face in uniform juxtaposed with images of him gently helping a child across a snowy street. The contrast was as jarring as it was powerful, and the public responded exactly as one would expect, with fury, reverence, and no shortage of condemnation for Karen. At home, Karen paced in her living room, a storm of frenzied thoughts consuming her. The curtains were drawn tightly shut, as though that would somehow keep the world out. Her phone buzzed nonstop, texts from acquaintances, missed calls from her boss, a slew of unread notifications from her social media apps all screaming the same thing. She was now infamous. She had tried to defend herself online, to argue that she was merely reacting to provocation, that the slap had been an instinct, a momentary lapse in judgment caused by stress, by traffic, by life. But her words were buried under an avalanche of vitriol. "You're what's wrong with this country," one comment read. Entitled, disrespectful, and proud of it. Another had simply posted the article about Mr. Jenkins beneath her attempt at a justification, as if to say, "This man's dignity speaks louder than your excuses ever could." Her husband had come home from work early, visibly shaken by the sudden fallout. "They suspended me," he said flatly when he walked through the door. "HR said it's not about what I did, but the board doesn't want the attention. They said you need to fix this before it gets worse." Karen had stared at him, mouth open, stunned that he of all people wasn't on her side. "You think I planned this?" she asked. "You think I wanted this to happen?" But he had only shaken his head and gone into the bedroom, leaving her alone with the echo of her actions. Max, meanwhile, hadn't said a word since getting home from school. He ate dinner in silence, pushing pasta around his plate, then retreated to his room without even turning on his video games. His quiet cut deeper than any insult online. She had tried knocking, even offering to talk, but he responded with a muffled, "I don't want to," and she didn't press further. In her heart, a creeping doubt began to spread. Maybe she had gone too far. Maybe this wasn't just an overreaction by everyone else. Maybe, just maybe, she was wrong. Across town, Mr. Jenkins sat at his small kitchen table with a cup of tea steaming in front of him, his injured cheek now a dull shade of purple. He refused any sort of treatment at the hospital, waving off the suggestion with a polite smile, and this old face has seen worse. He had lived through ambushes, bombings, and months of relentless desert heat. A slap from a flustered woman didn't even make the top 50. But what did shake him, in a strange and unfamiliar way, was the flood of messages that had come in since the videos had gone viral. Former students he hadn't seen in years had reached out, thanking him for his patience and his ever-present smile. Local veterans had messaged offering their solidarity and support. Parents from surrounding schools sent letters asking if he could speak to their children about what it meant to serve, not just in the military, but in everyday life. It was overwhelming. He never asked for this spotlight. He'd never wanted it. All he ever wanted was to keep the children safe while giving himself a reason to get up in the morning. Earlier that day, a young reporter named Alicia Tran had contacted him, asking for an interview. She remembered writing the original article during her internship and wanted to follow up on his story now that it was suddenly national news. Reluctantly, Mr. Jenkins had agreed, and now her new article was gaining traction. Titled "A Life of Service," the man behind the vest. It went beyond the viral videos and dove into his past. Alicia wrote about his time in the Army, his medical discharge, and his decision to return to his hometown. She included quotes from parents and kids, all testifying to his quiet strength and kindness. By the time the piece was posted, the public's image of him had become almost mythic, an unsung hero reduced to a traffic stop sign until the world was forced to look at him again. The school board had also taken notice. That afternoon, the principal called Mr. Jenkins and asked if he would be willing to speak at an assembly the following week. "We think the students could learn a lot from you," she said gently. "And well, a lot of the parents want to thank you properly. We'd like to make it official, something lasting." Harold paused before answering. He didn't need parades or plaques. But the idea of teaching these young ones that dignity didn't come from rank or fame, but from doing what's right day after day, that meant something. So he agreed. As the sun dipped low behind the horizon and the snowflakes thickened into a gentle flurry once more, the neighborhood that had been rattled that morning began to settle again. Karen sat alone on the couch, watching the news on mute as her own name scrolled across the bottom of the screen, her actions dissected by talking heads. Her phone buzzed again. This time it was her mother. The message was short, but it landed like a punch. "You need to make this right. This isn't the daughter I raised." And in that silence, with her world unraveling around her, Karen finally let herself feel what she'd kept buried beneath layers of defensiveness and denial. Shame. Not just because she was being judged, but because deep down, she knew that if her son had done what she did, she'd be the first to tell him it was wrong. And that realization hurt more than any backlash ever could. The following morning began not with sirens or shouting, but with a stillness that settled over the neighborhood like a fresh sheet of snow. For once, Karen's house was quiet. The clatter of her usual morning routine, the stomping through the hallway, the sharp clicks of her boots, the irritated groans at a slow toaster, was gone. Instead, she moved with deliberate silence, as though afraid even the creak of a floorboard might draw more attention to herself. Outside, Max stood by the front door with his backpack already slung over his shoulder. He didn't say a word as she approached, and when she offered to drive him, he shook his head. "I'll walk," he mumbled, not unkindly, just firmly. The words stung, but Karen didn't protest. She just nodded, watching him leave, his small figure trudging alone down the sidewalk while flakes drifted lazily through the gray sky. After he disappeared from view, she went back inside and sat at the dining table, her fingers curled around a mug of coffee that had long gone cold. The shame from yesterday hadn't dulled. If anything, it had settled deeper into her chest, weighing down her breath and tightening the space behind her ribs. Her husband had barely spoken more than a few necessary sentences since the call from his company. He hadn't blamed her outright, not with words, but his eyes held a disappointment she couldn't ignore. It was harder than the backlash online, harder than the threatening emails and angry voicemails from strangers who now saw her as the embodiment of modern cruelty. She had expected the world to be angry. She hadn't expected her family to quietly pull away from her in the way they now had. Across town, Millridge Elementary had a strange energy humming through its halls. The story of the slap, once only known to those at drop-off, had become the talk of the school. Kids whispered about it in the lunch line. Teachers murmured about it in the staff room. Even the older students from the middle school across the parking lot were asking if that's the school where the vet got hit. Yet amid the chaos, Mr. Jenkins stood like a pillar, unchanged, calm, and somehow still kind. He was back in his vest, holding his stop sign with the same gentle authority he always had, guiding children across the crosswalk as though nothing had happened. But the difference now was in how people looked at him. That morning, every single car that passed offered a wave. Parents rolled down windows just to say thank you. A few stopped completely to hand him hot drinks and cards drawn by their children. Someone even brought him a fresh pair of gloves, knit by hand, wrapped in a brown paper bag with a note that simply said, "For our hero." Harold smiled at each gesture with quiet gratitude, but never once puffed his chest or sought attention. He accepted it all the way he accepted the cold air and falling snow, with patient humility. At the school assembly later that week, Mr. Jenkins was invited to the stage. The auditorium was packed with students, teachers, and dozens of parents who'd come on short notice once they heard he'd be speaking. The principal introduced him with warmth, highlighting his service and his years of commitment to the community. The applause that followed was thunderous. Harold took the microphone slowly, scanning the sea of young faces before him. He didn't speak of war. He didn't bring up the incident or the slap or even his accolades. Instead, he talked about what it meant to serve with dignity. He told a story about helping a child cross in the rain and how the child had offered him a soggy granola bar out of gratitude. He spoke about small kindnesses, about showing up even when no one's looking, and about choosing patience in a world that demands speed. Being strong, he said, his voice calm and clear, doesn't always mean fighting back. Sometimes it means standing still. The students clapped again, louder this time. Even a few teachers wiped away tears. In the back of the auditorium, unnoticed by most, Karen sat beside Max. She hadn't planned on coming, but when Max told her about the assembly, there was something in his tone, a quiet respect, maybe even admiration, that made her realize how important it was. At first, Max had looked uncomfortable when she arrived, but he didn't stop her from sitting next to him. That was more than she deserved, and she knew it. During the speech, she didn't speak. She didn't move. She just listened, and with every word Mr. Jenkins spoke, her shoulders seemed to sag a little more under the invisible weight of guilt. After the assembly, there was a small gathering in the school gym where cookies and hot cocoa were handed out. Karen kept her distance, standing near the edge of the room, watching from afar as children swarmed Mr. Jenkins with questions and thank-you hugs. Parents surrounded him, taking turns shaking his hand. Max joined the crowd too, quietly, waiting for a moment to speak. When Harold saw him, he smiled and leaned down slightly, the way he did with all the kids. They spoke briefly, and Karen could see Max nodding, his hands moving nervously as he explained something. Then he turned and pointed across the room, pointed at her. Karen froze. Mr. Jenkins looked at her, really looked at her, and for a moment their eyes locked. She couldn't read his expression. It wasn't anger, but it wasn't amusement either. It was something deeper, measured, thoughtful. Then slowly he made his way across the gym. The crowd parted without effort. As he reached her, Karen stood straighter, suddenly feeling very small in the presence of this man whose only weapon was patience and whose only armor was grace. "I just wanted to say," she began, voice catching, "that I'm sorry. Not because the internet told me to, not because people are angry, but because I've been thinking about it nonstop and I know I was wrong. I lost control and I embarrassed myself, but worse, I disrespected you. I didn't know who you were, but that doesn't matter. Even if you were a stranger, you deserved better." Harold nodded once, his eyes never leaving hers. "We all have bad days," he said softly, "but what we do after them, that's what people remember." Tears welled up in her eyes, but she blinked them away quickly. "Thank you," she whispered, then added, "My son, he really looks up to you now. That means a lot." "I'm glad," he replied. "He's a good kid." They didn't hug, they didn't shake hands. They just stood in silence for a moment, an unspoken understanding passing between them. Then Harold turned and returned to the children where he belonged, and Karen, lighter now, though not yet fully healed, turned back toward her son, who offered her a quiet, almost imperceptible smile. It was a start. The final snowfall of the season came 2 days later, coating the town in a soft white hush that made everything feel a little cleaner, a little slower, as if the world itself had taken a deep breath. The chaos from the incident had begun to fade from the headlines, swallowed up by the next wave of viral stories, but within the town, the memory lingered, etched into conversations at school gates, into the way passing drivers lingered a little longer at the crosswalk, and most of all, into the eyes of those who had witnessed it firsthand. But time, like the snow, had a quiet way of covering scars and reshaping even the harshest terrain into something gentler. That morning, Mr. Jenkins once again stood at his post, stop sign in one hand, the other held up with practiced authority, as children filed across the street in bundled packs of laughter and wool scarves. He moved a little slower than usual, the ache in his legs sharper from the cold, but there was no bitterness in his eyes. He greeted each student with the same warmth he always had, offering nods to parents who waved from car windows or smiled from sidewalks. One of those cars, more discreet than before, a modest sedan instead of her flashy SUV, belonged to Karen. She sat in the driver's seat, engine idling, watching quietly as Max stepped out, backpack slung high and his breath forming little clouds in the air. They had settled into a quieter rhythm these past few days, fewer arguments, fewer raised voices. She no longer filled the silence with complaints about traffic or schedules. Instead, she asked him about school. She asked if he needed help with anything. She asked, and more importantly, she listened. He didn't always answer, but he noticed the change, and slowly, cautiously, he responded with a little more trust each day. Now, as he crossed the street, Max paused beside Mr. Jenkins. The two exchanged a few words she couldn't hear, but she saw the boy smile. She saw him glance back at her, give a small wave, then continue on toward the school doors. Karen gripped the steering wheel a little tighter. It wasn't guilt that gripped her anymore, but something more difficult to define. Maybe a kind of longing to rebuild, to grow into a version of herself that her son could be proud of. And it wasn't easy. Every time she passed someone in town, she felt the lingering weight of recognition, the faint whisper of judgment behind their eyes. The fallout hadn't ended with a simple apology. Her suspension from the community board had become permanent. Her face was still a meme on internet forums. Her friends, those who had once giggled with her at wine nights and PTA meetings, now kept their distance. Some were polite but guarded, others outright cold. And yet, in that isolation, she found something she hadn't known she needed: perspective. Without the noise of validation or social competition, she was forced to confront who she had become and why. And slowly, bit by bit, she began to unravel the tight coils of bitterness and ego she had wound around herself for years. She signed up for volunteer duty at the school, not in front-facing roles but quietly, stocking the teacher's lounge with snacks, helping in the back room of the library, organizing old donated supplies. At first, the staff were hesitant, unsure if she was doing it to save face. But over time, her consistency proved them wrong. She didn't ask for attention. She didn't bring up what had happened. She just showed up, day after day. And in those quiet moments, she rediscovered the simple dignity in doing something for others without needing credit. Mr. Jenkins never mentioned the slap again. In fact, he rarely brought up the incident at all, even when asked by the occasional reporter or curious parent. He spoke only of moving forward, of how people deserved the chance to grow if they were willing to try. When the school held its spring fundraiser, they asked him to cut the ribbon for the new outdoor learning space they'd created using a grant, something he'd advocated for years ago when he noticed how much the children benefited from being outside. When he stepped onto that little wooden platform, the crowd erupted in applause. Max was there too, standing beside his classmates, his eyes shining with pride. After the ceremony, he ran up to Mr. Jenkins and offered him a drawing he'd made. It showed the old crossing guard holding a stop sign like a shield, with the words, "Thank you for keeping us safe," written in blocky, crooked handwriting. That night, Karen sat beside Max on the living room couch as he scrolled through pictures from the event on his school tablet. She didn't say much. She didn't need to. Max turned to her eventually and said, "He's not just a hero because of the army stuff, you know. He's a hero because he shows up, even when people are mean." Karen swallowed the lump in her throat and nodded. "You're right," she said softly, "and I'm glad you can see that." There were no grand endings, no viral apologies or redemption arcs captured on camera. Just life, continuing, reshaped by the ripple of one moment and the choices made in its wake. Karen still faced judgment from some corners of the town, and she accepted that. She no longer felt the need to fight every accusation or explain herself to people who had already decided what kind of person she was. Instead, she focused on being better for the people whose opinions mattered most: her son, the students, and in an unspoken way, the man she had wronged. As spring unfurled its green banners and the snow melted into memory, Karen found herself parked near the crosswalk once again. She didn't honk. She didn't fidget. She just waited calmly, as Mr. Jenkins raised his hand and guided a group of children safely across the street. He caught her eye as she passed, gave a simple nod, not one of friendship, not one of forgiveness, but something else entirely. A quiet acknowledgement. A shared understanding between two people forever linked by a mistake, a lesson, and the choice to rise above it. And that, Karen thought as she drove away with Max beside her, was more than she deserved and everything she had hoped for.